Oslo is a city that is changing quickly. Over the past few years, they've made it a goal to reduce traffic congestion, improve pedestrian safety, and make it a much safer place for cycling. And it seems to be working. And since I was in Norway recently, I booked some extra time to visit Oslo. There's a lot of talk in urbanist circles about the rapid changes happening in Paris, and I took the train there a few months ago and made a video about that already. And while no city is changing as fast as Paris, I feel like more people should be talking about Oslo, because they've done a lot of things right lately. And they should be an example to every other European city on how to make a city more livable, more efficient, and safer for everyone. In 2015, the Oslo City Council got a left-wing majority, and the government made a series of important changes that promised to transform the city into one of the best examples of good urbanism on the planet. They committed to significantly reduce the amount of car traffic in the city, reduce transport emissions, prioritize safety for people walking and cycling, improve public transport, reduce car parking, and significantly increase the amount of trips taken by cycling. I'm planning a future video where I'll talk about how Oslo has significantly reduced road fatalities and effectively solved traffic congestion in their city center. Seriously, this is rush hour. There's like no traffic left here. But for now, let's talk about cycling. Norway has traditionally been a relatively car-centric country, at least by European standards. The country has a level of car ownership that is significantly higher than the European average and a relatively distributed population, which is not really that surprising for the 11th largest oil-producing country in the world. So Oslo has never been a cycling city, and to be fair, it isn't a cycling city today either. Only about 6 or 7% of trips here are currently taken by bicycle, compared to 36% of trips in Amsterdam. But the goal of Oslo is to increase that number significantly to 25% within the next few years. So how do they plan to actually do that? Well, the city government decided that the national road design guidelines were not sufficient to make that happen, so they commissioned their own, which was published in 2020 as the Street Design Manual for Oslo. This sets out all of the road design principles and priorities for the city of Oslo and is a recipe for safe streets and better bicycle infrastructure. Thankfully, the city published this document in English as well, and it really should be used by planners and transportation engineers in other cities as an example of how to do road design guidelines correctly. There's a lot of good stuff in here, from protected cycle paths to design considerations for wheelchairs, proper bicycle-only intersections, and bicycle-friendly roundabouts. They even identify the difference between a street and a road like Strongtowns recommends. Sometimes it's a little too Denmark for my taste and not enough Netherlands, but everything in here is achievable, at least to a typical European city. But they do include an example of a Dutch protected intersection with islands separating people cycling from motor vehicles. Good design guidelines are incredibly important because they determine how a street will be rebuilt. Streets do not last forever, and a street will need to be completely rebuilt every 15 to 30 years depending on the amount of traffic and construction methods. Which means that if your city is building safe infrastructure by default, then it's possible to make your streets safe automatically within 30 years and for no extra cost. This is exactly how the Netherlands built such high quality and consistent road infrastructure all over the country by putting in place good national design guidelines several decades ago. But that's the future. What is it actually like to cycle in Oslo today? Well, as you'd expect, it's a bit of a mix, so let's get into it. First, you can definitely see the impact that the new guidelines are having on new bicycle infrastructure. Most of the new infrastructure is built to a high standard with safe protected cycling paths, and infrastructure that's very easy to follow. They've got some great wayfinding signs here as well. This bicycle path is raised above the road and protected by a curb, as it should be. The sidewalk here is raised up again to make a clear distinction between the space for walking and the space for cycling. Though this street has an even better design where the curb between the cycling path and the sidewalk is sloped, which is safer if someone cycling accidentally hits it. It's interesting to see here, though, that the raised cycling path is not continued through the intersection. Instead, people cycling need to drop down to the level of the road at every intersection, which is less safe than the continuous sidewalks that are typically found in Denmark and the Netherlands. I'm not really sure what the thinking was here because the pedestrian crossings are raised here, as they should be, which means that a car turning right at this intersection will have to go up a curb anyway. So why not do the same at the cross streets too? Curiously, a few blocks down, this minor street does have a continuous sidewalk. But this kind of thing is exactly what you'll see in a city that's in transition to new road design guidelines. Old habits die hard, and sometimes even new designs are imperfect until every organization involved becomes comfortable with the new changes. The streets with good cycling infrastructure had quite a few people cycling on them, despite the hills and the cold and lousy weather. And unsurprisingly, busy streets like this, with only a painted bicycle gutter, had much fewer people cycling. Also, despite the new guidelines, I did not see any good quality intersections while I was in Norway, so people cycling are completely exposed when crossing. This will inevitably limit the number of people who are comfortable cycling here. But since the design guidelines are quite recent, there will inevitably be old infrastructure built to an inferior standard, and it will take some time for these places to be brought up to the latest design. In some cases, though, separated bicycle infrastructure might not be necessary at all. Even in the Netherlands and Denmark, you often won't find any bicycle infrastructure at all on streets with a 30km/h speed limit or less. However, this is only possible if car volumes are significantly reduced, and the best way to do that is to cut off through traffic to cars. Oslo has been putting in place modal filters to block off access to motor vehicles, while still allowing access for walking, cycling, and public transit. Ultimately, protected bicycle lanes are really car infrastructure, right? They're only needed because of all the cars. If you remove the majority of the cars and slow down the ones that are left, then people cycling don't really need anything special at all. And if you do put bicycle lanes, some selfish jerk in a Porsche is going to park in them anyway. The city center of Oslo has lots of quiet streets with no bicycle infrastructure and a few streets with some basic painted lines, which are both probably fine given the low traffic volumes. But the bicycle lane with the best protection I found was this one, which had these crazy bollards, which are apparently necessary to protect the Ministry of Industry and Fisheries. All right. It was nice to see that the new design guidelines have the correct design for bus stops, which allow people cycling to pass the bus stop easily and without stopping. This is the standard type of design used in both the Netherlands and Copenhagen, and it significantly reduces conflict between people cycling and people using public transit. As for bike parking, I saw lots of buildings with these very simple staple racks, which is a great design and it makes it easy to lock up many different types of bicycle. And a few of the buildings had signs for indoor parking too, which was nice to see. The central train station had some bike parking out front and a lot of rental bikes in this area that used to be for car parking. I also saw some signs for indoor bicycle parking, which was behind a locked door. Though in other places, there was a serious lack of bicycle parking. So there were definitely some good examples of new bicycle infrastructure, but other parts of the city center were really bad. There is no way I would ever want to cycle here. And I've been told that this road in particular is hated by many Oslo cyclists, though admittedly, this place used to be a freeway, so this street, while imperfect, is definitely a big improvement. I noticed that most people cycling cut through this new, mostly car-free neighborhood nearby instead, which is a much nicer place to cycle. I was also curious to see what it was like outside of the city center, so I headed out west. This cycling path is colloquially known as the Tour de Finance, because every weekday morning like this one, you'll see a regular flow of cycling commuters riding from the suburbs to their finance jobs in the city. This is a well-designed two-way cycling path that runs parallel to the lakeshore for about 6 kilometers, and it's definitely well used even on a cold and gray morning like this one. Unfortunately, it also runs right along the E18 motorway, which makes it a little less pleasant than it would otherwise be, as the sound of high-speed motor traffic can be pretty loud. A significant portion of the cars in Oslo are electric, but at high speeds, electric cars aren't really any quieter than gasoline cars, and I've talked about that before in a previous video. But thankfully, Oslo has buried their urban freeway, which keeps a lot of the traffic noise and pollution out of the city center. Still, as far as bicycle infrastructure goes, this is pretty good. I walked along this path for a while and was passed by dozens of commuters on their way into the city. And I saw plenty of cargo bikes, which is a great indicator species of good quality bicycle infrastructure. The path was being used by commercial bicycles as well, which is also great to see, and all in all, this was pretty great. So I was very surprised when I came across this. Some people continue up the bridge over the freeway, and that's obvious enough, but if you're continuing into the city, it's really not clear where you're supposed to go. You're supposed to merge onto the sidewalk here instead of the road, go around the bridge, cycle through the construction until you get to this connection, where the path continues into the city. I watched this area for about 15 minutes though, and pretty much everyone cycling got it wrong, which put them directly in the path of vehicles exiting the highway. This is the kind of experience that will prevent casual people from riding a bicycle, so it's really important to get these details right, even during construction projects. Cycling infrastructure is only as strong as its weakest link, and the value of a high-quality cycling path like this one is really diminished if it suddenly just ends and puts people in conflict with cars and trucks exiting the highway. But of course, it's clear that this area is under construction, so I hope that part of that construction is a better connection here for people cycling. And admittedly, the signage was more clear in the other direction. Fortunately, this was the only bad segment I came across, and the high-quality infrastructure continued through here, ultimately ending at Aker Brygge, a former port area that was converted to a shopping district in the 1980s. About 10 years ago, this area was significantly improved, and it has become a high-end destination for tourism, shopping, and work. It's a great example of a modern neighborhood designed to be mostly car-free. Once I got to Aker Brygge, I decided that I should probably try cycling for myself, so I picked up a rental bike here. Oslo has a bike share program with dedicated docks that is similar to those found in many other cities. These shared bicycles are sturdy and seem to be pretty reliable, and they even had studded tires on them in the winter, which is great because Oslo doesn't salt their streets, but more about that later. One really nice feature is this phone holder, which makes it easy to use your phone for directions. I already signed up before arriving in Oslo, so I just needed to use the app to find a bike and unlock it. Then, with a quick seat adjustment, I hopped on the bike and started off towards my hotel. Cycling through this area was pretty nice. It had nice, wide, low-car streets that are great for cycling. Unnecessary vehicle traffic is kept out of this area by using moving bollards so that only approved vehicles can enter. I really love modern developments that are mostly car-free. Though it was a little bit annoying trying to cycle through the large number of people coming off of the ferries. I probably should have taken a different route through here. One of the things that's very common in Nordic countries is that bicycles are generally allowed to cycle on sidewalks and in pedestrian areas. This is an easy way to make the city safe for cycling, but it only really works if the paths are wide enough. Otherwise, it's awkward cycling around people who are walking on the sidewalk, and maybe I was missing something, but the transition from cycling on the sidewalks to going back onto the street were really not clear to me. Back on the streets though, I noticed just how little car traffic there is in this city now. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the streets in the city center have no bike infrastructure at all, but given the extremely low vehicle volumes and the fact that Norwegian drivers actually drive the speed limit, it was perfectly fine. The big drop in traffic is due to some very recent policy changes though, so some of these streets are really wide for the small amount of traffic. So my bike ride through here was generally fine, but I did find myself in some awkward situations with the tram tracks. Like when I was cycling here in a narrow strip next to the tracks with a bus riding up my ass. In this area, which is the very center of the city, the approach is clearly to remove cars rather than build a bunch of expensive bicycle infrastructure, which is probably the right solution. I found a bike share rack right next to the central station pretty easily, and I docked the bike to end my trip. This bike trip was pretty short and simple, but I did manage to get really confused by the infrastructure at this spot. I was checking out this excellent two-way bicycle path here, but then it just ended and I didn't know where to go next. The guy on the bike here is doing what you're supposed to do, which is to go through this pedestrian area and to continue cycling here. I didn't even notice that this was a cycling path at first because it doesn't look anything like the others. The only indication is this little blue sign. But these are pretty minor concerns, and I assume it will get better with time. Personally, I'm a pretty fair weather cyclist. I ride a bicycle pretty much every day in Amsterdam, but that's because it's the fastest and most convenient way to get around. But if I have a choice, I usually prefer to take a tram or a metro, so I actually didn't cycle much while I was in Oslo. I think that this will be another challenge for Oslo on its way to becoming a cycling city. Public transportation here is just too good. I visited dozens of locations for filming located all around the city, and I was able to visit every single one of them trivially easy by public transport, so why would I bother cycling? I am sure that as cycling becomes safer, it would become a viable option for many people who may be underserved by transit, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in a city that is already well designed for public transportation. So for the rest of my trip, I used the excellent transit to check out the other bicycle infrastructure in the city, such as this bridge, which was built recently to connect two neighborhoods separated by a highway. This is a pretty car-centric area by European standards. I mean, it's not that car-centric because there's a metro station around the corner that has some pretty decent bicycle parking. But before this bridge was built, the highway and on-ramp were definitely a barrier for people walking and cycling. This bridge is quite steep, but otherwise it's very well designed. The bridge branches off 4 ways, making it easy to get on and off when coming from any direction, and there's a clear separation between space for walking and space for cycling. The branches for cycling in different directions also make sense. They're just 2 simple junctions, which is all that's needed for cycling. Bicycles aren't cars, and so they don't need roundabout signs or traffic lights. There are good wayfinding signs for people cycling here too. The cycling infrastructure on the other side of the bridge is really not that great for a 40km/h street, but that's the state of Oslo now. The new stuff is pretty great and the old stuff is not. All in all though, this is a pretty good bridge, and if the city's not going to remove or bury the highway, then this is the next best thing. This bridge was fairly well used by people cycling, but there were significantly more people walking. This was pretty consistent everywhere. Oslo is clearly a city where the majority of people walk and take public transit. This is not too surprising though, as the infrastructure for walking is actually quite good here, and there are many paths that are totally separate from car traffic. These can also be used by people on bikes, but they need to be wide enough to avoid conflicts between people walking and people cycling. A good example of this is a place farther out into the inner suburbs, where there's a busy roundabout for cars right next to a metro station. This is a pretty uncomfortable place to be outside of a motor vehicle, so thankfully these paths were built underneath the roundabout to make it easy to walk through this area. These are just about big enough to allow for both walking and cycling, though visually separating the two would be helpful here to avoid conflicts. As I mentioned earlier, Oslo does not salt their streets and sidewalks. Instead, they grit them with small bits of gravel like this. This worked actually better than I expected for walking, and the sidewalks weren't very slippery, but I would definitely not want to cycle here without winter tires. Other than the walking paths, I saw only minimal bicycle infrastructure outside of the city center. This popular shopping street, for example, was rebuilt recently, but before the new guidelines were in place, so people need to cycle in traffic between the tram tracks, which is going to deter a lot of people from riding a bike. So most of the people I saw cycling on the streets outside of the city center were doing deliveries by bicycle. Though the real crime here is how often the trams get stuck in traffic. And I was told that these bicycle lanes, which aren't even very good, received huge oppositions from residents when they were installed a few years ago, because the city removed street parking to install them, which is a familiar story to cycling advocates everywhere. As you go even farther out into the suburbs of Oslo, the bicycle infrastructure basically disappears altogether. Although I was still able to find a few people who were cycling on the quieter streets. Some of these places are still quite car-centric, at least by European standards, though there is definitely potential for safer and more comfortable streets as car traffic is reduced. But of course, all of these roads will need to be resurfaced or rebuilt eventually, and when they are, they'll be brought up to the latest standard. I had a great time in Oslo, and while there's still a long way to go, it's clear that things are moving in the right direction. Cities take time to improve, but implementing good quality road design guidelines is crucial for getting things right, and I'm very interested to see how these streets will improve over the next few years, as I will definitely be back. I've been traveling out of the Netherlands a lot more lately, and it's been great to see good urbanism happening all over Europe. So, definitely expect more videos from other cities in the future. And one thing I use literally every time I travel these days is a VPN, specifically NordVPN. Using a VPN lets me avoid that super annoying thing where websites assume you speak Norwegian just because you're physically in Norway, or when American news sites won't let you see anything when you're in Europe because they don't want to comply with EU privacy laws. These days, most websites are encrypted, but every time you're on a public Wi Fi, even in your hotel, people can still see which sites you're visiting. And that's not cool, because if they ever found out how often I visit carsofthebest.com, it would totally get me canceled. Thankfully, enabling a VPN makes your traffic invisible to other people on the Wi Fi network. NordVPN is ridiculously easy to use, and I have it on pretty much the entire time I'm traveling. I used to disable it when uploading my videos over hotel Wi Fi, but then I realized that NordVPN is so fast that I don't even notice a difference. It's always the Wi Fi that's the problem, not NordVPN. It also works on Android, so I use it on my phone too. If you'd like to give it a try, you can sign up at nordvpn.com/notjustbikes, and if you choose a 2-year plan, you'll get 4 months free using that link. And if you don't like it as much as I do, that's fine too, as NordVPN provides a 30-day money-back guarantee. Thanks to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. I'd also like to thank my supporters on Nebula and Patreon who pay me to find the next great cycling city. If you'd like to support this channel, visit nebula.tv/notjustbikes or patreon.com/notjustbikes.